Jehovah's Witnesses have been on the edge of their seats for over a century, expecting the end to come any 5 minutes now. Every time there's an earthquake, they all say, "See, told you, earthquake, sign of the end," completely disregarding the fact that there have been earthquakes since the beginning of time, and wars, and pestilence, and famine since the beginning of human existence. But the situation we find ourselves in now is a little different than usual. We haven't seen something like this happen since 1918. They thought it was the end back then too, but here we are, still trucking along. So I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at Doomsday Cults. Then we're going to talk about how Jehovah's Witnesses interpret the Bible differently from other religious groups. We'll start out with why Jehovah's Witnesses don't take blood transfusions, which is a popular question after my last video. And after that, we'll talk about the Bible verses and theology that leads Jehovah's Witnesses to believe we're in the last days of the last days of the last days of the last days.
In the final part of the last days, undoubtedly, the final part of the final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days.
Let's get into it. There's a subset of cults called Doomsday Cults. This subset is characterized by members believing that the end of the world is right around the corner. Lots of Christians generally believe that the end is right around the corner, but cult members tend to take their beliefs to the extreme. I would definitely categorize Jehovah's Witnesses as a Doomsday Cult. They put disproportionate emphasis on the end, when it's coming, how it's going to happen, what they're going to do when it does, and how they'll know it's here. There's a silver lining behind every mushroom cloud for this type of person. They want the end to come. They're excited about it. Generally speaking, people like this need to be kept away from a position of power for obvious reasons. Lucky for us, Jehovah's Witnesses aren't really interested in political power. They have, however, been preparing for it in their own way. For one thing, they've been contacting fated members to try to bring them back into the fold. Fader is an ex-Jehovah's Witness term. Basically, if you get disfellowshipped, you lose everything. You lose the friends and family you've known since the day you were born, permanently. So over the years, Jehovah's Witnesses have found ways to get around that punishment for defection. When I was in it, they used to have publisher's cards for every member of the congregation. Basically had information about you, when you were baptized, your standing in the congregation, that kind of thing. So the trick was to tell them that you were moving and have them transfer your publisher's card to another congregation, and then just never show up. You'd get lost in the system. They'd have no idea how to get a hold of you. You just stop going to meetings, stop talking to the authorities who could actually do something about it if they caught you breaking the rules, and you're pretty much home free. Technically speaking, your family hasn't been told not to talk to you or anything. Friends and family will report you if they find out you're breaking any of the rules, so you still have to kind of play the part when you're around them. But it's the best way to slip through the cracks so you don't have to deal with the strict rules and exhausting workload they drop on you. The point is, Jehovah's Witnesses have been tracking down faders in response to the virus situation. They think this is the end, and they're basically trying to circle the wagons. They don't want people in who aren't really living up to their standards. It's also an attempt to get some of them to come back to the meetings. Another thing they did to prepare for this is they passed around a letter to all congregations telling their members they aren't allowed to take blood transfusions, or plasma transfusions, or anything like it. I talked about this in my last video, but basically the FDA has approved emergency treatment for this where they transfuse plasma containing antibodies into a sick person. It helps them fight it off faster. As I said, I mentioned it in the last video, but I had a lot of people in the comments asking why they banned blood transfusions. So let me give a basic explanation, and we can use that insight to kind of get a glimpse into the perspective they take when they read the Bible. Their ban on blood transfusions is based on a few verses from the Old Testament, Genesis 9:4, Leviticus 17:10, and some others. Let's look at the Leviticus verse. It says, "I will set my face against any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who eats blood, and I will cut them off from the people. For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Therefore I say to the Israelites, none of you may eat blood, nor may any foreigner residing among you eat blood." It clearly says eat. So let's take a quick gander at the interlinear version of the Bible to see what that original word was. It's pronounced achal. I probably got that wrong, but it's something like that. The word literally means to eat, to devour, or to be eaten, through your mouth and into your stomach. The verse had a very specific meaning and intent. They didn't want people to eat blood, and that verse led to people changing the way they prepared their food. It doesn't even imply you can't use it medically. There's some early papyrus that seems to indicate that bloodletting was used in ancient Egypt. It was probably used in medical procedures during ancient times. The Bible doesn't say shit about that. Doesn't say don't use blood for medical purposes, which actually wouldn't have been out of place in the Bible, somewhere between Genesis and Revelation. I mean, it would have been a stupid rule to institute, but it wouldn't have been surprising to find. But guess what? You don't find it. All you find is very specific rules against eating it. The verses that reference it were specifically talking about eating animal blood, in reference to how food is prepared, not in reference to saving a human life by using it for medical purposes. And when you go through Jehovah's Witnesses' website about why they don't take blood transfusions, you find lots of excuses like bloodless medical procedures are less expensive, or it's safer, which is objectively not true. We can find out if blood transfusions are actually safer or not pretty easily by comparing the number of people with a medical condition and comparing the number of survivors who didn't take a transfusion to the number who did. If taking a transfusion led to fewer success cases, doctors wouldn't recommend it. Transfusions save lives, period. But honestly, it really doesn't matter. At the bottom of the page, they basically say, ultimately, our reasons for not taking transfusions is faith-based, not science-based. At least they're honest about it. No matter how many lives are saved, they just won't take transfusions. So there you go. For those of you wondering why Jehovah's Witnesses don't take blood transfusions, that's why. It's because of some verses in the Old Testament about eating it. Jehovah's Witnesses misinterpret those verses to mean you can't use it to save somebody's life. Anyways, that's how they're reacting to everything right now. They're circling the wagons to either bring faders back or disfellowship them, and they're banning their members from taking a necessary treatment. They're instructing them to tell doctors it's a personal decision, quote unquote. And if they don't, then they take everybody they ever knew or loved and force them to end the relationship. And if they don't end the relationship, then they'll force people to end their relationships with them too. So let's take a look at why they're reacting so radically to a virus. What makes this different than any other, to Jehovah's Witnesses specifically? This article is linked on the main page. It's titled, "What is the Sign of the Last Days, or End Times?" Here's the first paragraph. The Bible describes events and conditions that would mark the conclusion of the current system of things, or the end of the world. The Bible calls this time period the last days and the time of the end, or end times. The following are some outstanding features of the last days, or end times prophecies. War on a large scale, famine, great earthquakes, pestilences or epidemics, increase of crime, ruining of the earth by mankind, deterioration of people's attitudes, as shown by many who are unthankful, disloyal, not open to any agreement, slanderers, without self-control, fierce, without love of goodness, betrayers, headstrong, and puffed up with pride. Obviously, that last one is a quote from the Bible, 2 Timothy 3, 1-4. Next is breakdown of the family, with people who have no natural affection and children who are disobedient to parents. 2 Timothy 3, 2 and 3. No natural affection for family members. That's funny. Well, I guess it's more ironic than funny. Here we have a group of people who are forcing the members to stop talking to their friends and family. You can tell me all you want that it's their own personal choice and they aren't being forced, but you know as well as I do that's complete BS. Are there consequences for continuing the relationship? Yes, they'll disfellowship you too. If that's not having no natural affection, then I don't know what is. Okay, let's continue. Love of God growing cold in most people. Noteworthy displays of religious hypocrisy. Increased understanding of Bible prophecies, including those related to the last days. Global preaching of the good news of the kingdom. Widespread apathy, and even ridicule toward the evidence of the approaching end. The simultaneous fulfillment of all these prophecies, not just a few or even most of them. Oh, that's funny. So they say this is a list of things. If you think it's ridiculous, then that's just another sign it's true. So it's basically a box-checking exercise. That's what it comes down to. Once all of these conditions are met, it means the end is here. Except there are lots of examples of times when all of these conditions were met. Just look at World War I. I definitely call that a large-scale war. And while that was going on, the Spanish flu was ravaging the world. Jehovah's Witnesses existed at the time too. So I'd say they even met their weird criteria of global preaching of the good news of the kingdom. Earthquakes have happened since the dawn of time. Pick out any time in history, and all of this stuff has been a problem problem to some degree at that moment. Let's read the last paragraph in the article. Are we living in the last days? Yes. World conditions as well as Bible chronology indicate that the last days began in 1914. At that time, God's kingdom began ruling in heaven, and one of its first actions was to expel Satan the devil and the demons from heaven and restrict their activity on earth. Satan's influence on mankind can be seen in many of the bad attitudes and actions that make the last days critical times hard to deal with. The article references 1914 as the beginning of the last days. The reason they believe that really goes all the way back to the Millerite Movement in the mid-1800s. Millerites were convinced they had this convoluted Bible math that predicted the end of the world. Long story short, they took a verse from the book of Daniel and combined it with a verse from the book of Revelation and another from the book of Numbers and extrapolated from prophecies to end up with some numbers that added up to 1843. They were 100% sure the end was coming. It didn't. They moved the prediction up a few months. Still didn't come. That eventually led to the Millerite movement breaking up into multiple factions. One faction believed they had this weird convoluted Bible math right, but they had one of the variables wrong. One believed the Bible math was complete bullshit, as it was, and the other believed that something really did happen in the 1800s. Jesus came back invisibly, and we were in the last days. The founder of Jehovah's Witnesses was part of the "they had one of the variables wrong" faction. So he went on to make failed prediction after failed prediction until he lost so much credibility over the decades that he had to stick to one or stop making predictions. So he did both. He claimed the end would come in 1913. Of course, nothing happened. So he moved it up to 1914. Of course, nothing happened. But this time he pulled an old Millerite trick and said, something did happen. Jesus came back invisibly. We're in the last days. So Jehovah's Witnesses have been claiming we're in the last days since then. They made even more end-of-the-world predictions after the religion was taken over by its next leader, Joseph Rutherford. And of course, those fell flat too. They made a really big one in 1975, which, again, fell flat, and here we are today. They've been saying we're in the last days for over 100 years, but they try to keep their people in a constant state of stress, so they started saying we're
in the final part of the last days, undoubtedly the final part of the final part of the last days, shortly before the last day of the last days.
The next step they're going to take is to change their message from one of good news to judgment.
Kevin knows we're in the Great Tribulation. Why would he say he doesn't want anything to do with us anymore?
Darren, I thought you had heard by now.
Heard what?
When our message changed from good news to judgment, he was telling everyone that it would make problems for us and that he was done.
Which means they're going to stop inviting people into the religion. They're not going to stop going door to door, but they're going to start telling people the end is here and you're fucked, instead of come join our church. I can't imagine that's going to end well for them when they start down that road. Anyways, that's all I've got for you. If you like what I do and you want to see me continue to do it, check me out on Patreon. You can also check out my Etsy store. I sell all kinds of useful stuff on there, like these signs to keep Jehovah's Witnesses away from your house. Some areas still have Jehovah's Witnesses going door to door, even though they've actually been told to stop doing that. Considering the fact that they can't get certain treatments for their protection, please put up some kind of sign to make it clear that you don't want them knocking. You can get them from me, or you can set up your own sign to communicate the message. Either way, I just don't want to see more people die. That's my top priority right now. Okay, thanks for watching, guys.